Uriel Descending by Edmund, Siderius. The past can imperil the present daily endangers the future. I just never imagined that in all of this calamity we would have to face the future itself, not as a friend, but as an alien, ominous adversary. After some confusion at customs over my reasons for being there, Christoph and I had only just begun to explore one of the many Erdstall or Schrazelloch goblin tunnels discovered beneath the Bavarian countryside. At the time, no one knew what they were for, speculating only that the twin engines of human activity, worship or war, must have played their part. I was interested in their design, acoustics, and geological properties, having some vague sense that their layout may be related to the infrasonic waves I was then studying as a postdoctoral student at Arsenal University. Christoph, though, was exploring their anthropological implications. A local, he was subject to innumerable jokes about the Erdstall. Christoph was a dwarf, clever, driven, romantic, and caught between the Scylla and Charybdis typical of those on the fringes of society, between being fascinated by the myths surrounding his stature as narratives that gave history, common culture, and a sense of belonging to his otherwise isolating experience, and resenting them as parodies only able to obstruct his sense of self-determination. In either case, it seemed clear to me that these opposing aspects of his personality had ultimately collaborated in his study of the tunnels. That day we had only intended to map out one of the lesser-known systems. It was perched between two properties and had, until quite recently, been politically inaccessible as the owners of the lands around it contested each other's rights to the now potentially lucrative cultural space. Capital abhorring a vacuum as it does, Erdstall adventures and fantasy-themed performances had already become a major tourist attraction. The protests over preservation were also well underway by then. Just like the Galapagos, whose endless admirers eroded in countless footsteps that which they purported to love and admire. Now found, the Erdstalls were slowly beginning to warp and shudder beneath waves of human interest. Even my own activity was not so different, really. For the tourists, the tunnels drew their magnetic properties from their histories and the mystery they had come to represent, the sublime, deep and deeper still spaces of our unknown planet, and along with it our unknown selves, but accessible now, if only through the ivory gate of imagination. What was really in the Erdstalls? Dirt, mostly, but also something more. This elusive something more required no small amount of sifting, but was tempting enough to lend us perseverance. The entrance was small, covered over by matted grass and heavily shaded by the ash trees overhead. Both parties in the dispute had refused to let the other tend the space, in fear that this care would lend some special rights to the property. So it had grown feral, seemingly forgotten, if only because suppressed. It looked more like an animal's den than the other well-swept Erdstalls now open to the tourists, and cautiously, with light in hand, Christoph pushed aside the grassy curtain. We were greeted by damp earth and roots, and the heightened awareness of what little breeze remained. I had more trouble with the tunnels than Christoph, as they lingered at about 4 feet in height before opening up into something more comfortable for me. First, we would scout the space. Then we would set up the equipment, examine the construction, and make what measurements we could in those limiting conditions. On the first walk-around it seemed like many of the others we had seen, with few distinguishing features. The same puzzling changes in the height and direction of the tunnels, no clear connection between place and use, some signs of the methods employed to construct it, but little in the way of overt symbolism or iconography. Did you feel that? Like the earth moved? I had, but thought it only a moment of vertigo. Instead, Christoph's disconcerted expression in the wavering light reflected my own sense of discomfort and subtle displacement. Maybe bad air. Should we go? No, not quite yet. Just let me sketch the outline first. I made to trace the edges of the tunnels when my hand fell upon an uneven surface. Not even fell. It seemed positively drawn towards it. There was an opening that either had not been there before, or else had been shadowed in just such a way as to seem inaccessible. This was unexpected. There was another system running parallel to ours. I called Kristoff over. The entrance was tall but narrow, and we had to crawl sideways, crab-like, scuttling forwards. The parallel system stretched out like a promise in the darkness. When the tunnel opened up, we could see a layer of black dust obscuring the ground. Branching passages spread out ahead of us, tangled like a system of roots, coiling in a dendritic whimsy that only hinted at human craftsmanship. I turned to take in the space around me, and happened to glance behind at Kristoff, who was staring down in disbelief. We both stood petrified in a moment of recognition. There was a breeze in the tunnel, but no longer one of wind. The black dust rose up in rows of metal spines, not truly swaying, but crawling and tumbling over itself in an electromagnetic field. It lent an uncomfortable, claymation life about the motions, a surreality that was only reinforced when Kristoff barely whispered, "Where's the way out?" For a moment, I thought I'd seen it, almost as if it were growing or yawning, but then it seemed to fold in on itself and out of sight. Kristoff seemed puzzled, but matter-of-fact. "This does not feel Euclidean." Hoping that, like Theseus in the labyrinth of the Minotaur, we could follow the walls or find some golden thread to guide us, we groped around the ever more tangled tunnel paths until Kristoff came to one that did not seem like the rest. It became more regular, with some few but tempting signs of linearity. Maybe this way? Still, lightly brushing up against the wall with one hand, I followed him. Then all pretense of coincidence fell away from the design, as the passageway abruptly ceased to be of soil and gave way to a kaleidoscope of cold, rich colors, all fitted together like puzzle pieces, but of a hard and porous stone. A sharp angle gave way to a huge, expansive space, cathedral-like, overlooking a rectangular courtyard. The height of the ceiling only increased with distance, and graspingly glancing out from the second story, our small light was almost smothered in the architecture. Below us stood what looked to be a kind of castle or altar crafted from enormous, childish building blocks, and across from that, in the deeper darkness of the courtyard, a larger-than-life merry-go-round forged from burnt brass, with ornate designs of suns, stars, or orbs of fire. Suddenly, I knew, and the revelation came more like an invasion than an insight. Its base was the icon of some religion that does not yet exist. Kristoff felt it too. "It's a temple. It hasn't been built yet, but how can I know this? We need to get closer. We need to see what it means." A series of elaborate portcullises, 3 on each side of the upper level of the courtyard, lay open before us. At the end of each series there were stairs, leading inward and downward towards the far side of the lower level. We passed beneath 2 of these portcullises without incident. At the third, the world turned inside out. The blocks around us began to fold in on themselves, like a puzzle cube completing itself. The whole cathedral was manifesting the same kind of collapse as the tunnel entrance. Kristoff had almost gone down the stairs to the altar, but I had hesitated at the third gate. We both ran. Only one of us made it. I cannot say if he was crushed, for as I watched the darkness and the space itself unfold around him, he seemed to go unfolding with it, out of sight, until all that stood before me was a wall, dark, colourful, and flat. In shock, I pressed myself up against the more familiar earth of the tunnel, breathing heavily, and feeling strangely like I was at sea, trying to find my footing with the waves undulating under me. Then there came a sound like a rain-stick, a crescendo of clattering cascading down the passageway. A sun exploded to my left, setting off a chilling, unearthly chiaroscuro throughout the tunnel complex. Crustaceans, things resembling crabs and lobsters and crayfish, but of gold, silver, and bronze, skittled like a swarm of rats away from that bright light, paying no heed to me at all, pouring past my feet, tumbling over one another and spasming to right themselves again in a chorus of clicking and twitching and animal panic. An advanced wave collided with my psyche, and along with this information I was imbued with the impulse to run. The disruptions were not simply in time or space, but in consciousness as well. Waveforms rose and collapsed in my comprehension as I forgot things, the names of all the streets in the town where I grew up, the sensation of water running over and through my fingers, but also learned what I could never have known in a state of otherworldly elevation. They did something, the children of the future, to the sun, our sun, and it had consequences that they could never suspect and would never see. That was it, wasn't it? Like a candle in the sky, the sun had flickered on for too long upon the cosmic winds and ceased to shine. They didn't need to rekindle this fire, for by then they inhabited many worlds, but sought to keep this one as a kind of showpiece and point of pride. In doing so, they created a dangerous resonance. In this the two were entangled. The surface of the sun and the center of the earth are one and the same when one tries to fathom their extremes. Not solid, nor liquid, nor even gas, but plasma, puzzling and powerful. Whatever they did, whatever they intended, humanity had made these distant bodies into two poles, inducing something like a current, voiding time and space, and then a spark. My thoughts scattered. Feynman described the positron as an electron moving backward in time, but warned against applying such macroscale prejudices as cause and effect to the equation. But there were other ways of seeing things. Luigi Fantappe, when he was trying to make some kind of sense of the advanced wave solution to the D'Alembert operator, described potential syntropic phenomenon, moved by the future, but untestable until the future tested us. Was I now being tested? But how would we know what to look for? How would they? While there was light and sound and death and fire in great abundance when Krakatoa erupted, there was also almost undetected infrasonic waves, which traveled the world over several times. How subtle, how powerful, then, would be the echoes of the sun. The dendritic paths curled into themselves as often as not, and the crustaceans underfoot made my directionless flight only more difficult, yet always the blinding light advanced, showing me at least what to avoid. I turned down another spiral path and emerged to a dislocating scene of tranquil normalcy. Open air? Green? A breath of breeze through the tendrils of the trees? Soft sunlight. It was the quad at Arsenal University. Parked cars, bikes locked to the railing of the new academic building. But no people. Hesitantly, I walked towards it. But no, whatever else it was apparent that this was a kind of mind space, twinning over, through, and within our space like some inhuman origami, inviting but entrapping. I went into the new academic building and down toward the basement, as I had come to expect, whether through my own efforts or some quirk of the wave's effects upon my awareness. The basement led back into the Straße. But I had only lost ground, and in the freshly sharpened intensity of that calamity of light, I could just make out figures more unsettling than the skittering and fleeing vermin underfoot. It was a procession. A mad parade of writhing things casting long and flashing shadows, with manes of flame and limbs that moved in ways no mammal could compare with. They made noises like shrieking, but not in pain, in a strange, almost simian way, with the cadence of the grasping speech of human infants. And these were only the revelers at the head of the procession. Behind them, and further still behind them, was a seemingly endless array of stranger and stranger forms, far more aberrant and alien than anything human speech was made to lend a voice to. Where were they going? But no, directionality itself was a limiting abstraction to those who had looked down upon us from the highest reaches of the multiverse. Our words grew meekly up from this earth of 3 dimensions, sending out green and tender shoots in at most a parallel series of impenetrable lines, seldom, if ever, truly touching. And this could all be turned to ash. Their loftiness would not stop them extinguishing me in their passing, if indeed they even noticed. And then, eclipsing all other oddities for my attention, standing out magisterially as it made its way above the merry fray, striding upon the ceiling, humanoid, shirtless and sexless, came the prime mover of that procession. The appearance of fabric around its legs was like that of some ancient monastic order, and it billowed and blew in the same magnetic wind that tugged at the dust upon the tunnel floor. Upon its face, perhaps as its face, there hung a flat, ornamental mask like the brass disk of some dark sun, creviced and grooved and sharp, covering everything but its organ of speech. Insight washed over me once again, as parts of my ego were extracted in exchange. It was the angel of the afterlife of our future sun, this majestic horror, Uriel. These distortions were the psychospatial echoes of its meteoric, cosmic descent into a lower plane. What would a multidimensional substratum look like when it had intersected at an oblique angle with our own space? Light, perhaps? Light gave life to the sphere, but also established its limitations. The speed of light, wave-particle duality, the uncertainty principle, even photosynthesis. Yet photons in extreme conditions could also break those limits, at such high energy states that, in emulation of the Ouroboros, they come back around to bite their own tails. And I stood between where fang meets threat, a spark gap and gate drawing me only closer to this naked singularity. With a slow and measured gesture, with frenetic forms teeming and terrible dancing beneath it, Uriel raised its left hand in a circle, passing it over the mask to come to rest at a slight angle beneath its mouth, with fingers splayed. It then raised its right hand over its head, fingers likewise fanning outwards as it bowed its head, showing only more of the spears of the sun disk trailing behind it. And then it began to speak. It was not the Enochian of D, but Enochian it was all the same, the language of angels, awful and inhuman. It felt like I was being smothered in symbols and meanings both strange and familiar, all overlaid and tangled, accentuating features here, diminishing others there. Then I realized that these words from another world, they were waves, not of sound, not of 2 or 3 dimensions, but the waves in my awareness that I had already experienced, the disturbance of multidimensional space. This was all the Enochian echo from a sun that had yet to set. Illuminate in darkness. Liberate in darkness. Illuminate in darkness. Liberate in darkness. For all that its gestures spoke of speech, its mouth never moved. Its expression was silence, its proclamation all-encompassing. And then there was no way out. No further chute or branch of the tunnels to take, only the terrible options of having to turn and face that which was itself faceless, or look away and be sure to see no more. It was all I could do to find some crevice in which to cower, half eclipsed. If ever we were to dull or sharpen our senses 5, 10-fold, remaining as we were in all other respects, we would no doubt perish. As the procession approached, I could feel an uneven eruption of all of my faculties. My sight, now so fine that its resolution engulfed understanding in the details of what passed before me. The wild main things, each strand of blazing hair a fiery continent, each flailing thrust of their tangled limbs a global conflagration. My hearing, so expanded that I could just make out the crystalline collisions of distant nebulae, their individual stars softly tinkling and sparkling like chimes upon the void. Unable to properly place myself at the center of that jarring divide between the cosmic and the microcosmic, it was all I could do to discern that the main creatures, with their maimed and broken motions, had passed me by. Their speaking like shrieking like simian singing, echoing in the births and deaths of systems, and then passing by. And so it went, each shadowy form cast in crazed illuminations parading past. Even that most majestic of monsters, Uriel, rose zenith-touched, then set, as my skin crawled with the combined sensation of every unseen mite and worm burrowing and gnawing their way through the ecology of my flesh. Then, when I thought that I must surely die, or go mad, or disintegrate into a prismatic spray of conflicting perceptions, there came a point when everything reached such a fevered pitch that in a moment of free-fall, it almost felt as if I had been elevated to the point at which I could just touch the translucent membrane, separating this sphere from some other, unlimited realm. And then I was forced to descend. But I was not extinguished. After the procession passed me by, cast in darkness and in dread, I huddled up against the wall, waiting for the world to seem right again. It never has, but nevertheless, here I must remain. I was too small to notice. Every miner working below a depth of 30 feet died that day. It was the only ambiguous trace that something monumental had occurred. No one on the surface felt the slightest disturbance or tremor. After that enormous sunset, it seemed quite a simple matter to make my way out of the Shrazalok. Every tunnel, every turn simply straightened out, as if there had been only one direction after all. More difficult by far was emerging into the light, to see that once familiar orb glaring in the sky like a hangman's trophy, tugging at the world with its awful, open mysteries. Those few who had found themselves at that liminal space between surface and center contracted what came to be called a future fever, akin to chronic déjà vu, but also quite different. We could tell. We could tell with a terrible clarity the limitations of all we thought we knew about the world, each theory's incompleteness, the glaring limitations of every belief and dogma, but we could offer no alternative. And that was worst of all. Now my mind is alight, smoldering, electrified, ephemeral. I've learned 12 languages since then: Coptic, Syriac, Hebrew, Sanskrit, Mandarin. Dreams still speak to me of unimaginable machines, aspects of nature unnatural, but always, these visions are only enough to cast doubt on what is known, and never do they offer me any real guidance or greater insight. My heart, I know, cannot carry this burden for long, and I suspect I too will be buried beneath the waves of light that lap against the shores of some other world embracing ours. And even this thought is soon followed by its shadow, a shadow which has come to lead me. Illuminate in darkness. Liberate in darkness. Illuminate in darkness. Liberate in darkness.